disease. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're joining us from the east side of the U.S. or in Europe. Welcome to the Beer Bros Media podcast series, Ask Me Anything. Today, we're going to be talking with the guys from RX Green Technologies. We have Gary Santo, the CEO. We have Sean Cute, the VP of Product and Quality Control. Thank you guys for coming on. I appreciate you taking your time to do this.
Our pleasure.
Gary, let's start with you. Let's do a brief introduction so people understand who you are and a little bit about RX Green.
Sure. So Gary Santo, CEO of RX Green. I came to RX Green around October of 2023, having spent about 5 or 6 years on the operational side of the cannabis industry at a few different MSOs. Before that, I spent probably about 16, 17 years in structured finance, and then went to work in casino gaming and equipment, life sciences, technology, and so on. So, I think this was an interesting move in terms of why go from the operational side to the ancillary side, and it really speaks to the mission of RX Green. RX Green has always put out great nutrients, good cocoa, but really needed, I think, more of an operator's perspective, understanding what it's like to be on the other end of those phone calls and pitches, to understand form factors, the pricing, how people like to be supported in the garden. And that's really what we set about doing. When I got here and then tapped some former colleagues of mine like Sean, that's really what the goal of RX Green has always been about. Yes, we provide products, but we provide service and know-how first, and the products support that.
And Sean.
Hey, I'm Sean. I'm the VP of Product and Quality Control for RX Green. My background in cannabis goes back to the 2000s on the West Coast in the old Prop 215 days in San Diego. Over the years, I followed all spectrums of the market, from medical to the grayness and into the license side. I did to the East Coast and ended up being the head of cultivation for Gary, life at an MSO, and really what it looked like to scale up and everything, multiple states at one time. Gary headed over to RX Green. I made the decision to have someone with a, real cannabis background doing the team. I was happy to rejoin with him, and I'm excited to help our customers scale, with our products and beyond.
Well, and that's part of what drew us to this. There's a lot of ancillary businesses that aren't necessarily plant touching, but when we find a company that has people who have touched plants and are involved in ancillary, it means a lot more to us that they understand a lot more of the culture and the plant and how all this works. So it's good for people that are going to want to work with you to know that you have experience with it. Gary, let's get a first question for you. You've been a cannabis operator yourself before becoming CEO of RX Green Technologies. Looking back, what's the one mistake you see cultivation teams making over and over again that costs them the most money?
I think, and I've said this before, and each time I say it, I feel like I have a new view on it. But to me, it's about intentionality. I think when you take a look, especially in today's environment, I think there are so many growers out there who inherited the facilities that they're growing in right now. They might not have been part of actually building it out. And taking that moment to step back, and I did this with Sean when I hired him to come run the gardens at one of our former shops. It's, hey, what is our facility able to do? So let's break down each of the facilities. If it's multiple sites, let's break down what their capabilities are, the pluses and the minuses. That's number one. Number two, are there any issues that we need to address? Number three, what is the ultimate outcome that we're looking for in terms of what the retail and production side of the business is looking for? Are you trying to grow great flower? Are you growing flower that's going to go into the lab? Are you looking to do, extracts, whatever it is? Let's make sure we understand that. And then we get about the business of talking about what kind of strains. And then we break it into what do we think we can get out of these rooms? And I get that it's an uncomfortable place for some growers because essentially you're creating a benchmark for yourself. So when you say, I'm picking this strain for the following reason, I expect to get a yield somewhere in this range. I expect my terps and tax to be XYZ. yes, it's a bit of a benchmark. And for somebody like me, if I'm overseeing the grow from a distance, I'm not leading cultivation, those are critical benchmarks for me, because as we're going through the harvest cycle, if I know you're monitoring those and there's an issue, you can let me know, we can course correct, figure out what's probable, and move along the line that way. And as much as it's an uncomfortable place because now you're being measured, it's hard for you to get enough credit if you have a great harvest if nobody really knew what your original thought was when you planted it. So I think growing with intent is so important. Understanding how the strains you pick and the ultimate products you make have to fit within your facility, and then planting and going from there. I think too often people just rush to get a harvest in, pick a few strains because they like what they saw, they got something in Hall of Flowers, who knows what, and it's just a horrible match. And things go sideways out of the gates. And the next thing you know, they're spending a lot of time and money, and then ultimately they hit the easy button and send it to the lab, which if your intent was not to grow for the lab, it's not a victory to send it to the lab.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. You make a very interesting point when you said first that most people that are in a cultivation didn't build it. I would venture a guess it's a super small percentage of people now that are in a facility that they built themselves. And so that strategic planning from you guys is huge. I can highly appreciate that. Sean, you've overseen cultivation and production at several major operators. What's the biggest misconception growers have about maximizing plant performance?
I think a big misconception is that you can do the same thing and just multiply it. There's really a sliding, aspect that you have to factor in when you're scaling up, and a lot of that has to do with automation. On the people side, we want to keep the culture intact, and on the plant side, we don't want to look at this as just a commodity crop. At the same time, we have to see both the forest and the trees. We have to reduce the touch points as we scale. We want to be overhandling the plant, but we still want to usher them effectively through the life cycle. We love, they feel it. So really, I think it's just kind of a matter of good kung fu, just having no wasted movements, a really educated crew, and everyone in lockstep are moving forward and get the full harvest completed.
Yeah, and it sounds like our experience, a company is not just going to sell you a product; they want to help you succeed. Which we, as a cultivator, I can highly appreciate that part. I remember 10 or 15 years ago, you just had to be hush hush about buying products, right? You couldn't even ask any advice. Maybe in the forums, right? 20 years ago, we had forums that we were getting advice from other people. But to have a company that puts time and infrastructure behind helping their clients succeed is really the goal nowadays, in my opinion. Let's get into some of our user-submitted questions that came in earlier this week. This one is from Roger Rocha, the VP of Innovation, Emerald Miles Group. What is currently considered the best indoor growth system, lighting system in the market in 2026? What's you guys' opinion on lighting?
I think it really depends on what you want out of your system. It's like, do you need HPS lights because you're running a mixed light greenhouse and you're a region of the country that has cold winters? Do your rooms run hot because of your climate? Are you in two-tier? Do you need to, go with a product like TSR Grow, for example, where you can have the drivers in a different room to reduce the heat load? I think there's really a lot of great options out there. And I really tend to shop out of practicality of the application over just the name brand itself.
I would agree with that. I think when the LED lights first came out, that first mover advantage made it amazing, right? But I think now all LED manufacturers have gotten much better, where really you should be looking at the specs more than the brand name. Now, there's definitely some advantage to certain brand names. I'm not here to say all brands are created equal, but I agree with Sean. If you know what you're looking for first, let's understand what you're trying to achieve before you run out and get all hung up, because I think sometimes there's still that component of the industry that gets a little bit more attached to name and the ethos than the actual output product. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with both of you more. Honestly, the environment, like Sean said, if you're in a cold region, you might want to choose an HPS because it's basically just a big heat lamp that's helping you not only grow your plants, but heat the building you're in. If you're in a hot climate, you might be choosing an LED because you have reduced heat to it and you want to use less AC. So I think that's a great answer to both of those. For me, I remember the old single-ended ones that were parabolic hoods. Then we moved into singles with vented airflow hoods. Then Gavita changed the whole game, or double-ended bulbs changed the game 10, 12 years ago, and then LED. And so it's a long line of improvements that have led to an array of assortment. Where your environment, what are you trying to grow? Is it greenhouse? Is it indoor? So great answer on that. Our next question comes from Jessica Humphreys, the founder of CannaLife. As cannabis products become more diverse and consumers become more health conscious, how should cultivators and product teams think about translating cultivation quality, plant health, and production decisions into language that actually helps consumers make better choices without drifting into unsupported health claims? That's a long one.
That's a great question. I think I kind of look at the CBD market, and I look at all the claims that the early CBD products made and how many of those claims are unsubstantiated. I mean, just even the lack of consistency from product to product. And it really jaded, I think, the customer base out there. Then you saw the regular cannabis market to start to come into focus. And then you saw some pretty wild claims being made. Take this and, you'll sleep. Take this, you'll be smarter. Take this, it'll help you with whatever. And there are some people that works for, right? And the problem is you don't have the clinical research. So I spent some time in life sciences. I understand the whole clinical progression from the safety and efficacy to then, doing a broad enough trial to see does it do what it's supposed to do, what are the side effects, et cetera. No one's really done that because there really isn't a lot of IP in cannabis. So there's no monetary impetus to say, well, if I spend these tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars doing these studies, I can now patent this and I've got a nice runway where I can charge a lot of money for it like they do over in the pharma business. So that hasn't happened yet. You end up in this world where you have to really educate the consumer. And I think the hardest part and the trickiest part is cannabis, to a certain extent, I think has that coolness factor that has people who are new to it afraid to ask questions. I think, you go into a dispensary and there you go to talk to the bud tender and he's only got about 15, 20 minutes before he's supposed to get to the next customer. There's a lot of lingo being thrown around, a lot indica, sativa, etc. And it's almost like you feel nervous asking the question, well, wait a second, what does that actually mean? Why will I feel this way? Whereas I think it's more experiential. If you can get the bud tenders to say, look, I've got some people who bought this and they had stress and they used it and it worked particularly well for them. That's the best we can go for now. It's experiential, it's anecdotal, without making the claims. That said, the first half of that question, I think, is the exciting part, which is how do we translate the good things happening in the garden so that a customer cares about it? I feel like none of that is really discussed, right? Whether you grow pure organic, whether you don't grow pure organic, I don't know that customers know the difference at the end of the day. Heck, I know when I go to the grocery store, I'm not always sure what organic means and doesn't mean, in some of these things. And is it really better to have an organic tomato than not? I guess it depends. So, I think they're doing more to promote why should they care about the care taken in the garden and how does that translate to the quality of the product and the consistency? Those are key discussion points I think more and more companies have to do more to promote. I mean, Sean, what do you think? You've been on the other side in the garden on that front.
Yeah, I think, is it a quality product to begin with? Was it grown clean? Was it grown well? Was it, tested by a lab that's, doing a thorough implementation of those tests? Or there are bad operators who are out there, spraying their plants in flower and using things that might not come up. So there's also an integrity aspect as well. But, I think, Gary, with the anecdotal claims, that's something we can go off of because, it really is tough to have these health claims that are in stone with the lack of research that's been allowed, due to the legal status of cannabis. There's an deficit of, clinical research that we really haven't been able to do up to this point. That being said, the anecdotal reviews, can be really helpful. Hunting genetics in facilities, number one, smoke test. We're doing a little form internally on a 1 to 10 scale for, flavor, terps, appearance, effect, just frankly, how to make you feel. And that can at least give us a good base direction to go off of, because the indica, sativa, and hybrid labels are not really true. People have an idea what an indica or sativa might mean to them, but in essence, we're really living in a world of polyhybrids. And those terms, I think, are a bit extinct, but at the same time, this is what people know right now. And that's sort of the base off of.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I use indica and sativa to describe effects, but you really can't put that label on a plant. Everybody has interbred everything so much that quite technically, I doubt there's any straight sativas. Shouldn't say doubt. Very, very small percentage of actual sativas and actual indicas that are true. Everything has been mixed. And you bring up a good point. I can only imagine what it's like. I live in a cannabis bubble. I've been doing this for decades, and so the understanding that I have is just come normal to me. But for somebody new walking in, I mean, can you imagine how many questions they need answered before they get to the point of asking how was this flower grown? Like, there's a long list of things, and I'm a big supporter of anecdotal evidence because we came through that medical time when we weren't allowed to do studies here in the U.S. And so, to me, anecdotal honestly holds a lot more weight than most people give it, because cannabis affects everybody differently, right? The same strain could affect 10 people in 10 different ways. And not that it's a widespread change, but it is different, and it is selective to the person. So those are great answers. Gary, the economics of cannabis have changed dramatically over the last 5 years. If you were building or operating a cultivation facility today, where would you invest first, and where would you cut costs?
Wow, I hate to think of cutting costs before I have to build. I would say, the planning is what's key. And I think, if anything, when you look at the first facilities that were built, people overbuilt. Part of that was because so much money flew into the industry without any real demonstrated experience growing cannabis at scale. So you threw a lot of money to creating these giant facilities, all state of the art, whether or not all the pieces fit together or not, and not really understanding what the market could hold. Knowing that first mover advantage is rented space. So whatever you're growing and whatever else not, there's only so much you can do before then the competition comes in and it's going to be a price battle. So I would say, when you plan to build your facility, pick a space you know that you can grow into over time, but you don't have to light up all at once. And make sure that you get all the proper basics in there. So your water, your electric, your ventilation, all that. But make it so that you can turn on rooms one at a time as you see your product selling through. So get that first room going, dial in, sell through it, then light up the second room, see how the market takes to that, and so on and so forth. And I think if you can do it that way, the need to make cuts is a lot lower. I think what you end up with these other shops is they build 20 grow rooms when they only really need 10. Now they're trying to justify keeping all 20 lit. So now they are making crazy cuts, which then usually translates into terrible product, just pushing stuff through the door. So I think building incrementally, it's okay. And it's funny, because I remember when Florida was thinking about, legalizing on the adult use side, you heard so many growers saying, we need to oversupply the market. And I just don't know what market functions with an oversupply, unless that market is designed to have a race to the bottom for price. I think it's undersupply and creating demand is the way to go. So build compartmentally. I mean, do what you can to lay the groundwork and the foundation. Because yes, building individual grows by themselves can be very expensive. But if you're getting a big box and you're going to build into it, you can do it in a way that allows you to light it up as you go and aim small to small.
No, I agree with that. We got a question for Gary, and I'll get over to Sean real quick. How was the transition into the company as a CEO, and what are some of the biggest challenges you faced from Serena Maston?
It's all fire and brimstone. No. I think when you come in as a new CEO, it's always a challenge, right? I think what you don't want to do is come in and blow everything up. That is the worst possible outcome, even if the company is horrible. And certainly RxGreen was not horrible at release. But you recognize that you're coming in for a reason. Now, if it's just pure succession planning, it might be you're here to be the steward of the status quo, and that's fine. If you're coming in and saying, okay, your job is to professionalize or build scale or something like that, and you're dealing with a team that went through proof of concept, there are going to be some changes. And I think the biggest challenge is being able to identify who's able to go along with that vision. Now, the key to that, and this really goes to the leadership piece, you have to be able to articulate what that vision is. You have to lay out the mission, the vision, and the values. Make sure that your board and investors is aligned with it. And then turn to your leadership team and say, okay, this is where we'd like to go. Let's talk about how we think we can get there. And then assess the talent. And if ultimately you look at a department or a group and they are just embedded with doing things the way they've always done them, and it's pretty clear that that's going to limit you on a growth. And it's a big challenge because, look, a lot of people who do proof of concept, honestly, the skills that got them to that point, the scrappiness and the moving across multiple swim lanes, that is tremendous in a startup. But it's also the biggest hindrance when you try to take that startup and scale it. because one person can't do it all. You have to create the swim lanes and people have to stay in them. So it's being able to bring that sort of organization into play, doing your best to work with the talent that's there, because you want them to benefit from the work they've done so far, but then also knowing when you've hit that wall and it's time to layer in some new talent along the way. It's a balance.
Yep. Scaling correctly is an art, quite honestly. You know what I hear though when you say that? It's the way you're treating the company is very much the way you treat an issue you might have in the grow. You don't change 10 things at once because you don't know what fixed it. You start with what might be the most egregious, change that, and see how things happen, and then move on from there. Sean, when you walk into a cultivation facility for the first time, what are the first three things you evaluate to determine whether it's operating efficiently or not?
Well, out of habit, I'm looking at the HVAC units every time I pull up. I just can't. I think it's really important to have a facility that's properly outfitted. Every room behaves differently. It's set up perfectly. So knowing your room's abilities. The next I would say is IPM. What is the IPM protocol for that facility? Am I just walking street clothes? Am I coming in? Is there somebody wearing a beanie that day? Were they wearing that at home? Just like all these nuances that add up beyond just your scouting reports. Also when I'm, say walking a new facility, really how it feels. And that's in a couple different ways. It's like, is there a happy crew that they're working and learning? And there's a really good vibe going on, because I think that vibe doesn't translate to the garden. And then the other aspect of feel is, quite literally, how do the rooms feel? Walk into a room, does it feel good in there? Is there good airflow? Is it breathable? Does the plants look like they're happy? Is there heat stress? Is there humidity issues? Is it too dry? So I think there's a lot of feel aspect to that as well.
Yeah, I think you hit on two of the biggest things for me. Obviously, genetics are extremely important, but environment and cleanliness. Period.
Yep.
Like if I had to pick two things that you have to keep on point, those are the two things right off rip. All right, we have a question from Emily Chapin, Director of Sales, Garden Society, and Potley. What are your favorite cannabinoids and why?
Well, I really love the relaxation of CBG. I think from a smokability standpoint, I really love, caryophyllene and myrcene. They just always seem to be, especially myrcene just feels like a breath of fresh air. But I also love amosine and terpinolene. I like getting those unique flavors out of it. And depending on, my mindset, how my day is going, I might pick one or the other to start my day or end my day.
Yep. Gary, do you have any you want to talk about? Sean's hit right on mine, actually. The same thing as me. I like CBG and I like the same terpenes.
Yeah, Sean's experience certainly dwarfs mine on this one. This wasn't necessarily my jam in college. So I think from that perspective, I'm going to keep my mouth shut.
Okay, that's fair enough. All right, so we have a question for either one of you or both of you. Do you see any future of the cultivation being structured for medical dominated consumption market, or do you see the market is already structured to handle this? What may this look like? Do you think it's advantageous for the customers to know the soil medium and brands that brands use? Should this be communicated by customers, by bud tenders? We touched on that a little bit earlier, but let's talk about that again.
Well, I think that all cannabis is medical, whether you realize it or not. Even if you're smoking recreationally, there's still a medicinal aspect to it. It's going to be really interesting to see how those, two aspects come together, and also who's controlling them, and what of ours are we trading off to be able to have cannabis access in exchange for the control, and where's that control going? As far as how the product's made, I think there's some people that really do care a lot. Like a farmer's market, I'm really curious as to how that heirloom tomato was grown and what they did to hear the farmer's story, what the inputs were, because it sure shows in the outputs. In other cases, people are just happy to get something from a brand they know and trust, and they know the strain they picked up last week is going to be the same this week because they anecdotally really love the effects.
Now, I would add that if we are talking a pure medicinal market and we start to go down that path, production methods are going to start to matter, right? Are you GMP or are you not? And then what does that do to your facilities? How many facilities could withstand an FDA review if they really had to, or anything like that? And I think that's where it could be a little bit challenging cost-wise for some of the folks who maybe don't have the most state-of-the-art facilities. Now, that might have more to do with the production side than the actual grow side. It kind of will depend what it is that you're producing and how it's being consumed. So if you're making edibles or extracts or whatever it is. So, I think from that perspective, I agree with Sean that it really is a medicine first and foremost. So from a product standpoint, it's kind of we've always thought of it that way. We never thought that was a 4-letter word. I think, the other piece of that in terms of the inputs, that's an interesting question, because I think it's one of those where the education that's going to be necessary has to go beyond the brand name. There's some folks that say, oh, I use X brand name for my nutrients or Y brand name for my substrate. And most people don't know what that means and why does it really matter. Instead, I think the education should be, why do clean inputs matter more than anything else? There's a lot of good inputs out there, right? Some of them are just variations on a theme. We might have a bias towards RX Green. There's no doubt about that. But at the end of the day, is it because it's a brand name that we want to see succeed, or is it a brand name we believe in because of ... And in our case, it's because of the testing and the cleanliness of the inputs themselves. That's what should ultimately matter more than anything else. And then the conditions it was grown in, because I've seen people take some of the best inputs and the best genetics and blow it up by having horrible pest management, right? Growing on gravel floors, open doors, people wearing their beanies in and out of the facility, regardless of whether they went home that day and worked in their own garden. So you can destroy anything if you try hard enough. I think how you grow it is also as important as the products you use in growing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I do want to reiterate, you're 100% right, Sean. All cannabis use is medicinal. You can use it recreationally. You might want to get high, but you're going to get medical benefits from getting high, which really is what, in my opinion, separates cannabis from a lot of other substances that we use. Also, on that line, too, there's going to be consumers that are there's different archetypes of consumer, right? There's the consumer that's only looking for a price point because that's all they can afford, that's all they want to spend. They're probably not going to be so concerned with the growing medium, the type of growing, is it living soil, is it rock wool, is it salt, is it organic? They're not going to be too concerned with that. But there is a group of people that are concerned about, like you said, that are specific, like the same people that would go to a farmer's market and specifically want to get a small form organic piece of produce. You're going to have that same thing in cannabis with people wanting for their flower and concentrates. We have a question from Justin Bortman. Would operators, cultivators be willing to sit down and have a conversation on cannabis consumption lounges with on-site sales and consumption?
They should. I don't know why you wouldn't. If you were to ask folks in the alcohol industry, what's the best opportunity to kind of figure out your product and production, sit down with the bars. They're the ones who sell it. They have frontline interaction with all the customers. They see in real time how their products move. So I don't know why you wouldn't have that conversation.
Yeah, if we did have the ability to have a tasting room, especially when it comes to pheno hunting,
absolutely,
that would be the dream, and I hope we get there someday.
Yeah, and so let me say that is happening in cannabis. I've been to events at the Woods in West Hollywood. Woody's a big supporter of sun-grown NorCal farms, and I've been there for 3 or 4 different tastings with all my friends that have farms in NorCal. They come down to LA, and they're able to let people who wouldn't normally see it, because let's face it, a lot of those smaller farms don't produce a lot of product. They don't get to everybody that's available, and so it's an amazing opportunity. And let's face it, if you could sit down and talk with somebody to grow your food and understand how they do it, you'd probably feel better about eating your food as well.
I think it's interesting, though, both of you use the word tasting versus consumption. And I think that is something we have to figure out, because if we go the wine route, then it's a tasting, right? If you go the beer route, right, where you go in and now you can just drink as if it was a straight up bar, which are we going for? I do like that tasting idea, because that is truly what you're trying to find out. You're trying to learn more about the varietal, if you will, about the strain, as opposed to I'm just going there to hang out and drink as if it was a pub. So I think that's a great way to go. Call it like a tasting, and it changes the perception too, as opposed to just a bunch of people walking around in a cloud haze, you know?
Yeah, I agree with you. And you're going to have nuances to how the cannabinoids you're consuming affect you, and they're different to every person. But the real big difference in cannabis is honestly going to be the smell, the taste, the look. That's going to be a much bigger difference than the effects, in my opinion, of most cannabis you're going to get. Or maybe I just consume a lot and the effects are very similar. So I'm looking for different tastes and things like that. Shauna has a question for Gary. You're right. There's no IP in the plant itself, which makes me wonder where the research pathway opens up. GW Pharma patented formulations and got Epidiolex through the full FDA trials. With Schedule 3 easing research supply, do you see room for CPG grade cannabis? I'm sorry, GCP grade cannabis research and formulations, minor cannabinoids, or real world evidence? Asking as someone from pharma clinical research.
I think the short answer is yes, but I think it's going to have to work a little differently than it does in pharma research. I think in pharma research, the owner of the molecule has the economic benefit of investing all those millions of dollars to get it from point A to point B. That's not going to happen here in cannabis. I think this is the rising tide lifts all boats. So while we could wait and say, hey, maybe the federal government and the regulators will come in and do that, that's the worst possible outcome, because I don't think that works well for anyone. But I'd love to see the industry come together, and as a consortium, let's push these things through, because we will all benefit from that clinical research. So rather than one company shouldering the entire cost, let's do it together and we will all benefit. And then at that point, it really is, you're separating yourself brand-wise for whatever the reason. And in the same way, I hate to say the wine industry again, there's a lot of Pinots out there. There's a lot of cabs out there, and they all coexist and they all have sales and they all do fine at some level. I think the same can be done for cannabis. Now, they don't need to make the kind of claims that people want to make with cannabis. No one's saying I've done clinical research to prove a bottle of XYZ cab got me through the night. But, I think the flip side of that is we need to work together more collaboratively. It, to me, is when I first got into the industry, I was shocked that it wasn't more collaborative. I guess I just thought about the product itself. I thought about the plant itself and said, this could be a really interesting industry to get into where we're not trying to cutthroat each other. And I hate to say it, those first few years, the cutthroat was at an accelerated level, unbelievable. And now I feel like we're finally coming together. So yeah, there's no real impetus for one company to take it on. But if we work together and maybe some of these industry groups bring groups together and we can advance it that way, that might be the best way to get through and have the expense be shared and the benefit be shared. Does that make sense?
100%. I'm going to agree with you. Listen, collaboration over competition. We're at that point now. I've watched it go through from everything, and I give you a little insight on why it's like that, Gary, because I went through it. So when you were doing this illegally, you couldn't talk to anybody. You had to be MacGyver. You had to do your own AC. You had to do your own plumbing. You had to do your own irrigation. Then when we started getting legalization creeping in 16 or 18, the whole crab in a barrel thing took effect, right? We had all been working in our own little bubbles for years, so you can't tell even your own family members that you cultivate cannabis if you were doing it illegally. You just, I know a guy. You need some weed? I know a guy, right? But then we got into licensing and everybody started saying, wow, there's a whole bunch of us that were doing this. And now there's a limited number of licenses. It became a crab in the barrel type thing. Now, my feeling is 10 years from legalization starting, now there's been enough crabs in a barrel pull the other crabs down. There's only a few crabs left. So now I feel like we're in a competition, or in a collaboration over competition, or we might all disappear. We might be looking at single molecule Schedule 3 compounds, which I don't think any of us want.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see that high level research on the compounds. That would be incredible. At the same time, we cannot do that with the trade-off of not allowing people the freedom to grow their own plants. Period, point blank. And yeah, the inspections and the transition into the legal market, it was a crazy thing. When I was in San Diego County, we had the first actual license inspection in the county at that time, and it was scary as hell. And of all the half dozen plus groups that were supposed to show up, only one regulator showed up, and it was from the Department of Food and Agriculture. And I think that they were as nervous as I was, and we kind of looked at each other like, I was like, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do. And they're like, well, I'm not either. I was like, well, how about I just walk you through this whole process and show you, fire didn't show up, code didn't show up. Like nobody wanted to touch it. but we had to learn together, and I really hope it stays that way. I hope we all keep together.
Yeah, we've got a very similar story. When Beer Bros got our license in 2018 in LA, we were one of the first in LA, they gave 185 licenses out that were grandfathered in, pre-ICO and Measure M's. My brother and I were one of the first people that got the licenses beyond that. We got a manufacturing and a distribution license, and we were on the first day of inspections. And so we didn't have one inspector or two inspectors. We had all of them training, and they were all in our little tiny 2,000 square foot manufacturing and distribution area. They didn't know anything about it. I can only imagine what the first inspections on a grow were, because none of those people had ever even set foot in a grow. So they have no standards. They have no, like, other than building code, what do you have? And there's so much to cultivation that's beyond any standard building code of what you're doing. So
the second inspection was scary. That was like a 12-on-1, power round of questions, but we made it through.
We had police, we had firemen, we had inspectors, there was 20 people in that group doing the first day inspections in LA, and I want to say the latter half of 2018. All right, next question. Madison from Cannabis Disinformation here. From your vantage point, working with commercial cultivators, where do you see the biggest gap between how cannabis cultivation risk is actually managed on the ground and how it's perceived by regulators, banks, or the general public? Are there areas where you feel the science and data you have are out of sync with how the industry is treated?
Sean, you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I'm just sort of dissecting the question. Could you give that question back to me again, Bill?
From your vantage point, working with commercial cultivators, where do you see the biggest gap between how cannabis cultivation risk is actually managed on the ground, what's actually happening in the facility, and how it's perceived by regulators? We talked about this just now a little bit about our inspections, how they had no clue. So there is definitely somewhat, maybe not so much now, but there's definitely some kind of a disconnect between what they're expecting and what happens. And are there any areas where you feel the science and data you have are out of sync with how the industry is treated?
Yeah, I think that there's still some things out of sync. If you take the insurance aspect, for example, if there's a company that's manufacturing or growing cannabis and there's an insurance claim, it could be quite an arduous process. It's very difficult. It's really tricky to get exact crop insurance. There might be finished product insurance. And if you take a hard loss, you have to be prepared to weather the storm. If you go through a lengthy process and actually succeed, that might just cover the equipment that was damaged, for example, but you're really kind of stuck holding the bill with your crop and then you cycle back out of that. So it is something that's quite hard to articulate.
And to kind of build off of that, I think from a regulator, a bank, they tend to paint with a broad brush, and no two grows are the same. Right. So when you look at how one grow manages risk versus another, it could be in how they build, it could be their pest management, it could be the systems they use, it could be their maintenance schedule, you name it. There's any number of ways in cultivation to manage risk. And I feel like when people come in, even the public, it's always broad brush. They just assume it's a bunch of guys with beards and beanies running around, listening to reggae music, growing plants, and just smoking everything they grow. And the reality is there's a lot of science that's going into it now. Now, look, some of the criticism is well deserved, because there was a while when everybody held that knowledge very close. I remember you go into a grow, you can't take any pictures, you can't do this, you can't do that. It's like, all right, time out, guys. I understand what you're saying here, but to a certain extent, you're legal, you're in a regulated market, and there's nothing about your plant that's so unique that if I took a picture, democracy will fall as we know it. So I think from that perspective, the more I think we can do to educate those banks, to educate those regulators, that here's what you should be looking for, guys. If you really want, you need to start to separate the good growers from the great growers from the, boy, they need to do a couple of things different growers. Because every time you paint with a broad brush, we as an industry pay the biggest price for it. We pay the highest level for capital. We pay the highest for insurance. And what we're getting for products, and I'm going to probably offend everybody who's a vendor for us, and I'm going to watch my prices go up. We get subpar treatment. We don't get access to good payroll processing. We don't get access to good banking. We have some banks who are trying to step up, but what they're presenting to us is still something that's higher cost with lower benefit than the mainstream world gets. why are we paying this cannabis premium for something that's legal on a statewide basis? I get it. There's a federal component to it, and some banks just can't touch it from a regulatory perspective. But those that can shouldn't be, I think, putting the knife into us by making us overpay for mediocre service. So that's where I'd love to see us start to, whether it's the science, whether it's the data, whether it's the education. As much as we need to educate the consumer, I think everybody in the value chain needs to understand that there are some people that deserve certain things. There are some people that their grow doesn't deserve certain things. Yeah. Let's start to come up with a gradation.
Yeah, cannabis has been treated like the redheaded stepchild for a long time now. Just a quick example, back in 2015, when we were looking for warehouses in LA, it was medically legal. So according to the state, we were allowed to do what we were doing. If you were just renting a warehouse, it was 50 cents a square foot. If you told the landlord you're going to grow cannabis in there, it was $4 to $5 a square foot. And even legislatively, we get the short end of the stick. We're extremely taxed. We're extremely regulated. And they don't even go to bat for us. As a matter of fact, some would argue that we pay all these taxes and we're over-regulated, and they actually go after the people that are participating more than the people that aren't. And so it's just this super weird dichotomy of, I can't imagine anybody's in cannabis now other than the passion for it, right? Because the deck is so stacked against you, you have to have passion for this plant, or you're probably looking for another career route. Let's get one more question in for Sean. Cannabis cultivation is often described as both an art and a science. In your experience, where should growers rely on instinct and where should they rely on data?
I think data is so important. We really need to look at the trends, extrapolate those, and be able to take a look back at historically what's worked and what hasn't. That being said, I think we also have to have a combination. We have to be able to read rooms ourselves and understand those little nuances that can't quite be, captured. Use all sorts of sensors, for my substrate, for dry bags, for EC and pH and water temperature and all that stuff, and that's really important. But at the same time, I'm not sitting there staring at a screen all day, making sure my dry bag line dips and then goes back up. I almost use it more like a security system. I can go back and review the footage, make sure it's on point. Okay, great. But I'm keeping my head in the garden, and being there in person. And I think that's really where the art and science can often intersect.
Yeah, and I think if I could just add, I don't think the two have to be mutually exclusive. If you get really, really lucky, like I did when I hired Sean when I was managing an operation, you get someone who brings them both together. Because I'm not afraid to say that Sean has more experience with cannabis than I do, which means I'm going to ask why, right? And I think that's one of the most important leadership questions leadership lessons I've ever learned. Ask why before you tell somebody what or how, because you don't want a company that's just totally following your direction. You want to know why. So I would ask Sean a couple of questions. And if he just said it's by my feel, look, I can't tell you why. I can just tell you it doesn't feel right. And I have to make a big decision. One of the first things he did for me when we walked through our gardens, we had multiple operations in different states, and the operations were dramatically different. One was kind of a higher end greenhouse with the acres of green. The other one was more of an indoor state-of-the-art build. And we sat down and he said, Gary, I want to tell you, I think we need to kill our moms and pop everything from seeds. And so I just want to make sure I understand this because it's a publicly traded company. You want me to kill my entire mom room, so I'm going to start from seeds, from scratch, basically, and pray to God that these things pop in a reasonable manner. He's like, yep. Now, if I said why, and he said, well, it just feels like that's what we need to do, he wouldn't be here on this call, and we wouldn't have worked together. Instead, he was able to line me up with, here's the various pieces, and then he started to layer in the science and the data and the information, and then the feel came into it. And this is why I'm interpreting it this way. There's a place for them to both exist. And I don't think you should lean too much one way. I don't think you want to lean too much the other way, if that makes sense.
That's a good example, on the science side of the data, like really knowing the genetics, the background on the genetics, the crosses, the parents, the grandparents, and then, on the more art end of that, okay, we kind of have a good feel for the science. I know it's going to work together. On the art side, I can kind of see like which phenos are leaning this way or that way, start to call those. I'm killing those moms in advance while multiplying these moms over here, and then, kind of narrowing it down. And we actually did that on the same day in 2 states. And up that way. And yeah, I'm not going to lie, slightly nervous, but at the same time, I've done it before and I've done it since then, and it worked out great.
And it worked.
Yeah, no, well, and I'm glad to hear it worked. It's a lot like the anecdotal medical claims that then are backed up by data, right? And so you knew, you had a feel, you had an instinct that this was happening, but you didn't have proof. I feel that good cultivators and exceptional cultivators are the same way. They have a passion and an instinct, and the data now comes in as a backup. Like, I knew that was happening. I didn't know exactly why or what the data said, but now I do. And then that person's instinct and intuition just steps up, because now what they were thinking and feeling was backed up by data. So
that's a perfect example too, actually. Like, vapor pressure deficit, super important. My grow team at the time in San Diego, we discovered it by accident, and it was a long time before we knew what it was actually called. And it was really from equipment not functioning how we wanted it to. But something miraculous happened in that room. Everything checked the box extra. We were like, whoa, something happened. And we did have data at the time. It was more in the sense of notebooks and whiteboards that we would take pictures of on our phones, because we didn't want to have too many things in the cloud. And I think there was the cloud at the time. And it was after the fact. One of my buddies was like, I think this has to do with barometric pressure. And I was like, I don't think that's it at all. That has nothing to do with what we're doing, but he did have the word pressure right. And we found out later, okay, it's vapor pressure deficit. So all we knew is these levels of humidity and temperature worked. And if we keep doing what we did then we can use that data and keep getting good results.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is you can't grow good plants by just looking at a screen and going straight by data, in my opinion. Maybe some people can. I would say for most, that's not going to happen that way. You have to have some kind of a feel or an instinct or a passion for the plant, and spending time in the grow rooms. Like, to be perfectly honest with you, I'd much rather spend time in a room, in a grow room, than in front of a screen. So, well, I highly appreciate you guys coming on. I'm a grower, so we could keep going on and on and on, but I don't want to get into too many minute details that the viewers might not be that interested in. Do you guys have any closing statements you'd like to put out there about RX Green or yourself or the conversation today?
I think from the RX Green front, we got into this business at the front end because we felt the good, clean inputs are going to only help you along the way. And if you have a good system and a good growing process and good SOPs, our good, clean input should get you the rest of the way there. So I would say that if you haven't checked us out, take a minute, check us out. Always, always, always ask your vendors more about their products. Ask them for COAs. Ask them about why certain blends are what they are. Test their knowledge a little bit. Don't just trust the name in and of itself. Even us, if you're a loyal supporter of RX Green, thank you. But never feel afraid to challenge us, because that's how we get better. That's how we created some of the products we have on the market right now. We're just in a continuous state of learning and improvement. So hopefully that's what we're doing. We're trying to get the word out more and get people focused on what's important in their grow and what really will help them, as opposed to, what's cool to have. So we'll see how it goes. But Sean, anything you want to add on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many variables in the garden. It's, you have to be an eternal student doing a lifetime of troubleshooting, and, an effort to reduce variables as much as possible. From a media and fertilizer standpoint, having something that's consistent, kind of avoiding the pitfalls of, things aren't really tested for Fusarium, Pythium, Aspergillus. I really love when people ask the questions why. And I actually, separate from RX Green, I'm still an active grower. I have a license in Colorado, like Host Cannabis. I'm running our dry fertilizer in our cocoa. I use it every single day, and the team uses it every day. So we're not just sitting here, looking at data and the science, which we are big time, but we're also looking at the art of it and nuances. We have some really great breeders, like Mousetrap and some other ones that are running our gear, and we have some pretty cool labs coming up with, like, Green Shot, other super loud. So, we just want to keep pushing it and just see how this actually works within the real life application, and then back up all the new ways and test results you could do.
Well, I love the ethos of the company, because it's very much like you should be as a human. You should be striving for constant improvement, right? Be better tomorrow than you were today. And it sounds like that's what you guys are willing to do for your clients. Real quick, before we jump off, tell everybody where they can find RX Green, whether it's social media or website or any other areas they can contact you.
So you can go to our website, obviously, which is www.rxgreentechnologies.com. We've got a YouTube channel. I know we're on Instagram. We are in LinkedIn as well. Our products are available in a number of retail stores through a number of distributors out there. So certainly ask for it by name, or like I said, come to our website. Those are probably the best ways to find us. And you'll see Sean and me and some others of our sales team out in the markets. We try to go out on a monthly basis and get out and visit the grow stores as well as the grows themselves. And do what we can to help educate and bring people along the curve.
Yeah, we help people all the time, even if they're not buying our products. First and foremost, I want to know what people's pain points are and help them out in the garden. If they buy something, if they don't, so what? We're all together, and all of our paths are going to cross again anyway.
Well, treating people correctly will mean they'll be a consumer or a customer in the future. So that's a very smart way to go. Well, I want to thank Gary and Sean from Our Extreme for showing up today at the AMA. I want to thank everybody who joined in to listen. You've been listening to the Beer Bros Media Podcast AMA series, and we thank you all for joining.